So today's guest for Women in AI Ethics monthly AI expert webinar is Shahla Naimi. She's also based in New York, like myself. Shahla is the policy director in the Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology at Salesforce. She focuses on issues around AI and human rights. Such a pleasure to have you today, Shahla, and I'm so impressed with your background as are our audience as well. Welcome.
Thanks again for having me. This is just such an absolutely wonderful community, and there's nothing that brings me more joy than talking with and sort of in conversation with other women in AI ethics. So I appreciate having this time and space to connect with you all.
Fantastic. So let's get started with your career journey, because I know a lot of folks are very much interested in learning about this space, but really about your career journey. Where and how did you get started in the field of human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will sort of caveat this with saying that I think one of the really beautiful things about all of these fields, technology broadly speaking, AI ethics, human rights, people sort of come at these topics and fields from a lot of different directions. I think the interdisciplinary nature or, the sort of curviness of a career tends to be very prevalent in these particular spaces. For me, it was just as dynamic. I mean, you just sort of shared kind of a high level overview of my bio, but I did spend the first decade of my career in sort of the humanitarian assistance space. I saw that some folks are joining from that space, which is really exciting. Susie, I see you're at CARE International. I worked with CARE in Afghanistan and in Kenya and Somalia for some time, and really focused on helping different governments, both local institutions, but also international institutions that were trying to set up different programs around the world, as well as nonprofit organizations like the Alcohol Development Network, CARE International, Oxfam, and sort of international organizations, various UN agencies in particular, kind of working through all of these different organizations to help them really identify how to both evaluate and improve aid delivery, and assess and help address, really whatever challenges a community was facing in a really practical, culturally relevant way. So I spent about the first decade of my career traveling a lot, and sitting on floors a lot and drinking a lot of tea, and having a lot of different conversations in many different languages. And I moved to New York after that for personal, kind of for family reasons, and really wanted to sort of translate that experience into a new space. And was particularly attracted to sort of the tech space and thinking through how do these kind of massive corporations, how do these massively critical organizations and structures, what is their relationship to human rights? What's their relationship to everything that I had just worked on in the previous decade? It was very clear what the relationship in sort of the humanitarian nonprofit space was. It was clear what the relationship with governments was, but really wanted to sort of like take a step back and think through what are corporate obligations like, what are sort of the impacts of corporations when we think about broader issues around economic development and human rights. And so that's sort of how I ended up bringing these two spaces together. But my background, my academic background, me, as you mentioned, it's in political philosophy, it's in anthropology. I'm a trained anthropologist. I have another master's in international human rights and humanitarian law. So I'm kind of bringing a handful of different perspectives into the space.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm always blown away by the diversity of backgrounds and richness of experiences that women in this community bring. And you're absolutely exceptional in that, because your background is both in the field, like you said, working with these communities, understanding their perspective, and then taking that into large companies and helping them see things from the lens of those communities. And I think that's very powerful. We do need that bridge, rather than people making decisions just based on academic or theory. Can I just ask you a personal question? Because that intrigued me. You said having conversation in different languages. How many languages do you speak?
I speak Farsi, Pashto, and Spanish in addition to English, and I speak a bit of
Mm.
Arabic. So Farsi, for those who are not terribly familiar with some of those languages, I'm Afghan. My parents were refugees to the United States from Afghanistan in the late 80s. And there are many languages that exist in Afghanistan. The two particularly prevalent languages are called Farsi or Dari, which is a dialect of Persian, sort of also spoken obviously in Tajikistan and in Iran, and Pashto, which is also spoken in Pakistan. And so those are the two primary, those are the languages I would say I'm most comfortable with. I also grew up in Southern California, where I was lucky enough to get a lot of kind of both informal and formal exposure to Spanish. And so those are the primary languages that I tend to operate in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, because that I feel like there's so many different ways you can connect to someone at a very human level. One is through language, because you can communicate, and there's so many things that cannot be translated into so many phrases that cannot be translated in the English language. So that definitely builds a connection. And the other one I feel is food, because food is such a big part of all our cultures. So thank you so much for sharing that.
I will just jump in there to say that my husband is a former chef, and we think about those things quite a lot. But it
Wow.
is also, quite relevant, obviously, to the AI ethics space when we think about linguistic diversity and building and building in sort of native languages. And so, how are we leaning on translation tools, and what are we losing in that process, and how can we build those tools a lot better? There are thousands of languages that exist around the world, of course, and very limited exposure to many of those languages online. And so thinking through how these can be really useful tools to help bridge some of those gaps. In addition to delicious food, I think those are two very critical elements of path forward.
Amazing. Again, I couldn't agree more. And I feel like, yes, we are getting a lot of amens. Yes, definitely to yay to linguistic diversity. And we do need more of that for sure. Now, large organizations tend to be somewhat of a black box. For people on the outside, it's hard sometimes to figure out what's going on inside. And they are, especially the larger the organization, the more complex the org structure gets. Now, you are part of the Office of Ethical and Human Use at Salesforce. Can you help our audience understand the organization structure? Which function or C-level executive does your role report into? And also, is this typical for large companies? Because I'm trying to help folks who are trying to navigate the job market today and trying to figure out like how should they be thinking about the career journey and what are the entry points.
Yeah, absolutely. The Office of Ethical and Humane Use is remarkably unique. But I will sort of speak to that, as well as, where do human rights functions tend to sit in different companies, tech companies in particular. So that's the space that I work in. But the Office of Ethical and Humane Use, it's a really unique structure. It has a dual reporting structure, both into product and legal. And I think that that tells you a lot about kind of the key players and what makes this kind of work extremely impactful. I have not seen it at any other major tech company, its equivalent, but it is really unique to Salesforce. And I think a sign of Salesforce's really deep commitment to responsible business practices, and truly a big reason why I was and am really excited to be at the company. I do hope that other companies can consider in the longer term kind of similar models in the future, but our office specifically is focused on tools that allow people to sort of lean in on the highest risk, highest judgment decisions and to sort of delegate the rest. And so we have three structures within the office. One is focused on accessibility, one is focused on responsible AI and technology. So those are very, very heavily focused on, how do we build and identify appropriate product guardrails? How do we, ensure that we are building AI tools responsibly, having, really living our trusted AI principles around responsibility, accountability, transparency, inclusivity, and empowerment through our products and services across the entire company. And then we have our policy team, and that's the team that I sit on, which works really closely with both of those other teams around kind of responsible AI and tech, as well as accessibility, but then also looks external to our customers. And we have these really remarkable services that we provide to our customers. What are the guardrails that we provide to our customers to ensure that they are using it responsibly, and how do we sort of set them up for success in abiding by kind of both regulatory needs, but then also just kind of the values that are critical to us as a company. So it's a really unique structure. Our Chief Ethical and Human Use Officer, Paula Goldman, founded the office several years ago and continues to lead it. But again, with a lot of collaboration with product and legal stakeholders in this space. I'll sort of take a step back to say that this, where human rights functions within companies tells you a lot about the way that the company approaches it. So at different tech companies, these functions live in different spaces. And I think that as folks are sort of navigating the job market and trying to understand, well, how do I take my human rights expertise and translate it into a company environment or a tech environment? Like, ask yourself, where does that function exist? Does it exist in a compliance department? If so, you're probably going to be focused more on due diligence directives and due diligence compliance specifically. Does it live in, a philanthropic organization or in, corporate social responsibility functions? That tells you the kind of work that you would be doing around partnerships and grant making and other such work. And so I think it tells you a lot about where the company, how the company approaches human rights issues. Is it a philanthropic question? Is it something cross-cutting for the entire company, as it is the case for Salesforce? Is it more of a compliance question? And so it tells you a lot about how to navigate that space. So I definitely encourage people that, as you enter interviews or as you look at roles, like, ask yourself, what is this? What is that reporting structure, and what can I learn about that structure based on that information?
Thank you. That was so helpful. I even such sage advice again, because there are so many dimensions to human rights, and people bring so many of their own expertise, and everybody has diverse expertise that they bring to this space. So it's important to make sure that you're aligning with how the org works, but also making sure that you're being very thoughtful about where you can play the role and where your expertise can be applied within the organization. One thing that I always consider a red flag when in organizations, this function sits under PR or reports into some sort of PR, because then it's not as serious. What I liked about the organization structure that you described, it is taking policy, but it's also taking implemented, and you can see it in the product as well. But you're going one step further, and you're also informing your clients, because Salesforce being a global company, you have a large client base. So that's absolutely critical. So thank you for sharing that. It was just like, it's definitely a unique structure, and it seems to be one that is very effective as well. So now let's talk about the scope, right? About what are we talking about when we talk about human rights in the context of AI? We're seeing AI being deployed in a lot of different spaces, different sectors, many different use cases. Can you talk to us about how the mass deployment of AI and the usage of AI is impacting human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first I'll just say in a lot of great ways, and then I spend a lot of my day thinking about risks and mitigating risks, identifying risks, and I will get to that. But I will say that I very rarely get the opportunity to talk about positive aspects of work as well. So I will start there for my own sake. But there are a lot of ways that AI helps advance human rights in particular. As sort of the clear ways that many of us are aware of and have talked about: improving access to information and education, democratizing access to a lot of more capabilities, right? You don't necessarily need to have have a master's in computer science to be able to code. As an example, you can sort of build things from scratch a lot easier. One of the spaces that I continue to be particularly excited about is the ways that it can improve health outcomes. We've seen, already just really remarkable examples of AI's processing and analytical capabilities, and that's already having real positive outcomes in pharmaceutical development, clinical trials, et cetera. There's a lot of work to be done there when it comes to bias identification and mitigations. But I think that as a starting point, there's a lot of really good work happening there, and I'm really excited about that, because if you don't have kind of a baseline of bodily security and health, then being able to exercise freedom of expression or political participation or other civil and political rights or social and educational rights is essentially a moot point. There are some prerequisites in these processes. So there are a lot of really wonderful ways that AI is advancing human rights, but all of that rests on what I mentioned earlier, which is managing the risk. And that's everything from, the kind of ongoing conversations we've had around bias and training data, privacy and data protection concerns. The inference of sensitive data and AI-powered tools is something that's particularly top of mind for me on a regular basis. But I think those are also the spaces where there is a lot of really strong and growing both industry alignment, civil society learning, and quite a few risk management frameworks, both kind of existing within companies, but then also in international spaces at the government level that are emerging. And so I'm particularly encouraged to see companies like Salesforce and the broader industry really focus on learning more about and building substantial guardrails around these issues. So AI is an extraordinarily powerful sort of set of advancements, and as we particularly move towards the agentic era, we're just going to see it impact essentially all human rights.
Fair enough. Uh, I like, yes. When we think about ethics, ethics is not glamorous, it's not sexy. It's always, we are looking at a lot of ways that we are actually studying a lot of these technologies and think, how could this be better? How can this be developed more ethically? And looking at where these, what impact does it have on society, humanity? So I'm glad you started on a positive note. There are ways. It's a choice that we are making. We can create more ethical technology. We can deploy them more ethically. So I'm glad. We do need some positive energy right now. In this, especially in this space. Now, we have to have a reality check. We're talking about businesses and these enterprises, and they are driven by business objectives. They are obviously, they're committed to stakeholders. They made a commitment to this, the employees, and there is business objectives that are leading a lot of this product development, a lot of these initiatives. How do you then balance the business objectives with human values? If you can give us some specific examples at Salesforce, what do those conversations look like? And what are some of the trade-offs we should know about?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a sort of set of questions that folks in AI ethics are always grappling with, and everybody has a slightly different approach. I think one of the things top of mind for me, and it's sort of, it's a big chunk of the reason why I chose to work at Salesforce in particular, is how do you make ethics and how do you make human rights in particular become a core business concern? So that, and I saw in some of the chat, questions around shareholder value and the bottom line, so to speak. So how do you bring these topics of conversation into the bottom line and make it a core concern? For Salesforce, I feel particularly lucky to be at this company because the number one value of the company, which is truly lived in principle by every single employee, from a new hire up to our CEO, is customer trust. And we work with customers in highly regulated industries, and they have extraordinarily sensitive data that they trust us with. And so they trust us and they really need us to be responsible actors. So for us, it makes a lot of sense to prioritize these issues around AI ethics and responsible AI, because it's part of the reason why any of our customers are willing to do business with us. It's part of our business offering, essentially, because they can feel confident, right? Somebody working in medical sciences or in financial services, they can feel confident they're getting that responsibility upstream. And the best way to do this is to prioritize humans at the center of our company values, and it sort of trickles from there. So to give you kind of the tangible examples of what that trickling looks like, we have a number of in our AI tools. We have something called the Einstein Trust Layer. This is a really critical part of our work, and I think kind of a fundamental architectural guardrail. And the way that this trust layer works is that our customers are giving data to us that we're holding, and then we go through a series of things within the trust layer before and after it is ever sent to or shared with a third party foundation model. And so that includes sort of features like data masking and anonymization. And what that means is that we're automatically processing data before it's sent to AI models to remove any sensitive information, right? That data, those questions around privacy are really critical to us. Another thing that exists within the trust layer is auditing and logging, right? That's creating records of AI model interactions and data access for accountability, because our customers want to be able to kind of open the perennial black box and dig in and see how did we come to this conclusion. Another really critical thing is data residency controls. So that's really around ensuring that data remains within specified geographic boundaries, that our customers have, that the right people have access to the right level of information, and that we are focused on minimizing that whenever possible and giving customers control there. And so I think that those are some of the like tactical and tangible ways that within the product we are building customer trust, and how we really bring in sort of core human rights principles around privacy, data protection, explainability, and translate that into our products. But again, we're in a rather fortunate situation because our customers not only expect this of us, but they demand this of us. This is really critical, because without this, they would never share, their sensitive information with a external company or external party.
Thank you. That is such a key point, that customers are demanding. I feel like that also helps make the right business decisions. I feel sometimes there seems to be this general notion that companies just do whatever they want, and tech companies are doing, just making these decisions in a vacuum. But there's also should be one of the considerations is, what do customers want? And right now we are seeing this trend across the board, and also thanks to a lot of work like yourself and other brilliant women are doing in this space, raising awareness as to the importance of why we need more ethically developed technologies, whether it's privacy, whether it's data sovereignty, or what. There are so many different dimensions to it that I feel like it can be a competitive advantage for companies, because if customers are demanding it, then companies also are more incentivized to do the right thing. So there is a lot of push and pull, and I feel it can be a good thing for the sector in general. In your opinion, yes, go ahead.
Well, I'll just jump in there to say
Yeah.
that I think there have been, prior to my time at Salesforce, I was at Google and worked a lot more heavily in the social media space. The last 2 decades in the social media space have seen a lot of ethical issues, and the silver lining there is that it has brought a lot of awareness to the general public, to policymakers, to civil society organizations, to others within the company, and carved out broader space for these kind of trust and safety conversations and these ethics conversations, human rights conversations to happen. And so AI is such a kind of set of powerful advancements and tools. And one thing I'm particularly heartened by is the fact that communities like this actually exist, because these communities did not exist 20 years ago for other kind of transformative technologies. And so I'm particularly grateful that these spaces exist and are really top of mind for a lot of folks, because it's essentially because it is what makes these things competitive advantages and business imperatives. When these types of communities exist, when these conversations are open and in the public, and happening in all spaces, in schools, on the street, and over the dinner table, this is exactly what makes it a business imperative to make sure that we're kind of developing and deploying technology responsibly. And what becomes kind of ideas and conversations like clear disclosures, right? You're interacting with an AI system. This is something that today, in July of 2025, we just expect. If you are interacting with an AI system, we expect that disclosure. In a lot of cases, it's legally mandated that disclosure happens. 4 or 5 years ago, that was not the case. And so it's what takes kind of voluntary practices and discussion and makes them into standards for the industry, and in some cases, regulated requirements.
So well stated. So first of all, thank you. We are absolutely honored to even be able to provide this space and have this space to listen, insights from brilliant women like yourself. Our community started back for folks for whom this is their first event that they've hosted. Since 2018, we have been hosting these events and making the expertise from our community available to everybody on demand, no paywalls, just so that more folks are aware of all the great work that's being done, because so much of the conversation was being dominated by, tech is a very male dominated industry. So it does diminish sometimes the voices, and it overshadows the work and the voices of women doing the work. So it's absolutely an honor to have folks like yourself who are so busy, who take the time to come and share your expertise. So first of all, it goes both ways. We can provide the platform, but it also takes someone like you to take the time to come talk to us and our audience today. So folks, and those of you who are just joining us, we are recording this conversation. It will be online. Today's conversation is with Shahla Naimi, who is the director at Salesforce, focusing on AI and human rights. And we are midway through this conversation, but I want you to know that we will be, this is a 45-minute conversation with 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A box. We might miss it if it's in chat because we have a very engaged audience and there's a lot of conversations happening. So drop them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And our volunteers are also sharing links to Sharla's work. And please follow her, support her, engage with her. Her blog is online. Her LinkedIn profile is also open. So again, we encourage you to follow her work. So moving on. We talk about big tech, not in just terms of, when we talk about big tech, it's not just about their revenue, trillions of dollars. It's about the scope of their impact, right? The amount of reach, the extent of reach that big tech has across customers and clients and organizations, so even government. What do you feel, in your opinion, is or should be big tech's role in safeguarding human rights? What is their responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question. And I think one that's really top of mind and continuously evolving. So at Salesforce, we've publicly committed to something called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And for those who might not be aware of it, they were developed in 2011, really out of kind of a growing recognition of business impact, understanding that, both local, but then, in particular, multinational businesses had a tremendous amount of impact on human rights around the world, both positive and negative. And so there was a recognition that the kind of existing legal frameworks were often insufficient to effectively regulate those impacts and provide remedies to individuals who are impacted. And so from that, from a long process, the UN Guiding Principles came about, and they provide really a global framework for kind of identifying, preventing, and addressing human rights abuses or harms linked to business activities. And they are structured kind of around three particular pillars. One is the state duty to protect human rights, which is a fairly high standard, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and then the need for access for remedies of people who are impacted in that process. And so what this essentially does is it helps set norms that are particularly helpful, especially in the AI space where, the regulatory space, the technology, everything is sort of still heavily evolving. Help set norms around what internal guardrails and processes could look like. And so that includes setting, conducting human rights due diligence before, for example, you enter or expand presence in a country, or before kind of launching any major product updates, to be able to sort of take a step back and identify and prioritize and address potential or even actual human rights impacts. And so that's the way that I tend to think about it a lot, is that, we are a global company. We are going to have a lot of impacts around human rights. I like to think that, a lot of those are positive. It's better data access. It's better kind of public service delivery. It's a lot of really good stuff, but we do need to make sure that we sort of take a step back and have a risk-based approach, and are really intentional about how to identify potential adverse impacts to human rights, and work closely with teams across the company to mitigate those effects. And so that's the way I think about it. And not every company has committed to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, but we do think that they are a very useful global framework. And again, really lean on internationally recognized frameworks like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights.
Uh, Thank you. And Claudia just said in the notes about in the chat that human rights is the ultimate intersectional issue. And I really, yes, yeah, couldn't agree more. It speaks to everything that you just said. I, so speaking of global, your role is global in scope. Every country has a different approach as to how they interpret and administer human rights, which I can only imagine how challenging that makes your role, because not only are you having to navigate the shifting, the developments in AI, but also the shifting norms, right? Which are pretty much are led by the administration or the governments of different countries. So how do you reconcile that, the differences in different nations, different governments' approach to human rights?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fantastic question, and I think it's one that not just companies, but really any international organization is sort of consistently grappling with. For us, and the way that I tend to approach it is that one, we do anchor on universal principles, and so the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the ICCPR, the UN Guiding Principles that I just mentioned, they really do recognize that fundamental human dignity is non-negotiable across all regions, and I think anchoring on those universal principles is sort of the first step. But then, as you kind of rightfully noted, it is kind of understanding the local context and setting up structures. And I sort of anchor on that a lot because I, in tech companies in particular, people move around a lot. They move roles, they move to different companies, people's lives change, et cetera. And so I, it is wonderful and amazing and important to have people with human rights backgrounds in tech companies. It is more important to have structures in place that value human rights and that integrated into the broader company risk management frameworks or sort of processes, broadly speaking. And so for us, we have multiple structures like that, and they anchor on how do we understand local context and how do we engage external stakeholders. And so I'll give you a very tactical example there, which is we have something called the Ethical Use Advisory Council that our office goes to for strategic guidance and advice on particularly thorny issues. The makeup, the composition of that council is a mix of external experts in AI and human rights, a handful of different spaces, as well as kind of what we call frontline and executive employees, understanding these folks sometimes have different perspectives. And so we need to have both perspectives at the table, the executives of the company, as well as the frontline folks who are dealing with questions day in and day out. And so all three of these stakeholder groups essentially come together to provide us with guidance and direction on particularly challenging issues. We also, kind of in addition to that, have a human rights stakeholder program. And that's really where we engage with civil society organizations, with academics, but essentially folks outside of our particular industry to kind of understand what are the challenges with X, Y, and Z products we're thinking of building, or X, Y, and Z kind of action that we're considering as a company, and how do we kind of leverage those insights and that expertise and that on the ground local context and understanding to then be able to identify and thus mitigate the risks. And so I think for folks who are coming out of the kind of a customer experience space or user experience space, this is or like myself, anthropology, like this is fairly basic, right? Like you don't do something without talking to the people who it will impact. And that's not always the case at all tech companies everywhere. And so I think it is really critical to try to develop structures where you can understand the local context and engage stakeholders, but always anchor it to those universal principles and standards because they've been around for long enough at this point. And for the most part, there is decent global consensus around them, even if they are interpreted differently on the ground.
Thank you so much. That's such a key piece that you just said. We shouldn't be reinventing the wheel. Like Silicon Valley keeps reinventing the wheel as if human right democratization was something they just invented yesterday, or they just came across this concept yesterday. I like how you're grounding in principles that have been set like well for decades, if like not centuries. So bravo. That is something I feel like we should all keep in mind constantly, that this was not just in these are not concepts that were just invented yesterday when Silicon Valley decided they mattered, or if they think they matter. But that said, I will wrap this up because I want to give plenty of time to Q&A. We have so many questions coming in from you. It just shows you how important this conversation is. I will just have wrap up on one last question, and just folks, so we typically don't record Q&A to give people, keep your opinions private, or sometimes just to protect people's privacy. But today we will be recording. I will not mention names. If somebody has asked a question, I just want to make sure I'll try not to mention names, just protect your privacy, unless you're okay with me mentioning your names. But that said, we will wrap up with one last question for Shahla before we jump into Q&A. You represent Salesforce on Freedom Online Coalition's advisory network. Can you talk a little bit more about this organization? And also, do you have recommendations on other organizations that folks in the audience should follow or engage with who are actively working on safeguarding human rights in the age of AI?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep it brief so we have time for Q&A. So the Freedom Online Coalition, it's a coalition of governments. And they are dedicated to sort of advancing internet freedom and human rights online. And the advisory network is an independent group that is comprised of kind of representatives from civil society, academia, and like myself, the private sector. And our job is really to provide kind of advice and recommendations to these FOC governments on the coalition's aims, their objectives, and various issues that are concerning human rights online. And so we provide sort of statements and guidance from our perspective around what are sort of the key challenges and some of the ways that they might be able to tackle it in spaces that they're in. And we do, sort of shifting to the second part of your question, spend quite a bit of time also thinking about what's our perspective, and then what's the sort of broader perspective, which is kind of equally multi-stakeholder and sometimes conflicting and on thorny issues, and thinking through that. So some of the organizations, there's so many amazing organizations, starting with this one, so many wonderful organizations to sort of follow. There are, of course, kind of the international organizations. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, they've put out just really useful guidance around AI and human rights, have done some great taxonomy work. The OECD's AI principles and a lot of the kind of risk management focus that they have with emphasis on kind of human-centric values and approaches, I think is a really helpful kind of foundation for folks who have not come across those. But then there are also just a ton of groups within kind of both academia and civil society that I recommend. I always value reading work that comes out of the Center for Democracy and Technology. They publish a lot of work that's very privacy first and really practical guidance which is particularly helpful for someone like me in industry. The Partnership on AI, we engage with them pretty regularly, bringing together civil society and tech to develop best practices. Again, they're looking at sort of the most complicated issues and trying to kind of work through them together, which is, I think, really critical and helpful. Just a few others, and there are just so many, so much great work happening in this space, and so I'm not gonna do anybody justice, but I do particularly enjoy reading work that comes out of the Berkman Klein Center and the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, as well as Article 19. I think Article 19, is a global organization. They focus a lot on promoting and sort of advancing freedom of expression and information online, and so they do a lot of really important advocacy around human rights due diligence and AI development and thinking through AI governance issues. And so those are some of the organizations, but truly the list is absolutely endless. And so I think it's also very possible that there are folks who are joining us today who run some really important organizations. So I would love to hear what those are too for anyone who's open to sharing. Oh, Mia, you're
I'm on
sound is
mute.
off.
We'll make sure that we share the names that you have just links to the organizations that you have shared. I'm also following a lot of the same organizations that you mentioned. They're absolutely doing amazing work. So we'll do that. So I'll move to Q&A now. So first question is from Sky. How can we better balance the Silicon Valley approach of moving fast, breaking things with the need to take a thoughtful and ethical approach to AI development? I've been to a lot of AI talks here in San Francisco where there's limited talk about bias, ethics, and ecosystemic impact of these tools, and that concerns me.
Yeah, it concerns me as well. That's a great
All of us.
question. I think, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I do think these things are only successful, however success can be defined and however challenging that might be, if ethics are integrated from the ground up. And that they're not an afterthought that, Mia, you touched on this earlier, that it's not sort of a PR exercise, but that, design starts with ethics and ethical considerations need to be embedded at the very beginning of the AI development lifecycle. And so, ensuring that the product teams and that those very early kind of conversations have somebody who is talking through these issues and thinking about, how do you bring ethics into the conversation and how do you think through these kind of thorny elements. The only way to do that is really through interdisciplinary collaboration. And so, finding ways to collaborate with folks on the product side, data scientists, ethicists, social scientists, legal experts, human rights experts, et cetera. I think those diverse perspectives, even just from roles in addition to other types of diversity, really are critical. I'll sort of state that as one element that comes to mind. The second is, and again, I think that folks in the AI ethics space see this and experience this quite a lot, but it is not common across the entire private sector, which is ensuring that AI ethics is at the very top of company values, and really present there. And so, asking like, does the company have clear AI principles, however they kind of frame it or define it? Do they have clear guidelines? Are these public commitments? Do they conduct impact assessments or have kind of monitoring education? Do they have development opportunities for folks within the companies on how to learn about these issues, right? We cannot take for granted that somebody, we're getting trained in particular disciplines and fields. My background is in human rights, and I have been trained up in AI technologies, right? And similarly, somebody who may have a different background needs to be trained up in human rights topics. And so that happens through conversation, but can also happen through internal employee engagement and training. And so, how is that company investing in its employees to make sure that everybody has some baseline training and some sort of spaces for conversation and escalation, et cetera? So, it's a concern and something that I think about a lot. I would welcome any ideas that you might have as well in terms of how companies can sort of approach this topic.
Thank you so much. And I find that this conversation with you is so powerful because this is a reality check. Everybody out there, it's like so many people out there, right? Giving talks, giving speeches, showing up at the right places and talking about this. You're actually in the trenches doing the work. And it's not always glamorous, it's not always sexy, but this is the work that needs to be done. Shahla, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so good to meet everyone.